So I have to share a warning with you that you are about to be shocked by what I'm going to say. And I lead with that because I'm going to speak about something that you really shouldn't talk about from the Bima, but I think it's worth it. And that is something I heard about just the other day, which was a Facebook post of a matzah pizza with pepperoni on it. And the person who told me about this specific matzah pizza said, I don't get it. Like, what are they doing? They're so proud that they're keeping Pesach, but they're obviously eating pepperoni. Like, what is this? And I want to use this artifact, which probably belongs in a Jewish museum somewhere, maybe not, to think about kashrut, which is admittedly my absolute favorite topic. And I want to think about it in two ways. I want to think about kashrut through the lens of Pesach, and I want to think about it through the lens of all of the dietary practices that we are commanded year-round. So Pesach, the insistence that we not eat chametz, is most clearly stated in Shemot chapter 12, verse 15, where it says, whoops, should have brought it with me. Kol shivat yamim matzot tochelu, ach b'yom harishon tashbitu saor mibatechem, kol ochel kametz, nefesh nichretu mi-Yisrael. So we are told, for 7 days you're going to eat matzah. On the very first day, you're going to get seor out of your homes, and anybody who eats chametz in this period of time, their nefesh, their soul, is going to be cut off from Yisrael. This is a really high bar. The nefesh being cut off is not language that we get for very many mitzvot, and this might give us a little bit of insight into why we get a little anxiety around the kashrut of Pesach. Why we scrub our homes, maybe go to great lengths to rid ourselves of chametz, even though at the end of the day, the prayer that we say right before we enter into Pesach, where we do biur chametz, and we say, any chametz that is still in my possession, may it be like the dust of the earth. Like I let go of control in this moment. But everything up until that point is meant to be about a really high level of stringency. And that is one experience that we have of keeping kosher. And it may or may not have been the motivation of this person who took the bread, the pizza dough, out of their pizza and replaced it with matzah, or more likely, they were participating in an aspect of kashrut that I think is quite familiar to all of us. And that is the aspect of kashrut that's about identity. That's really about participating in our culture, in our people, and sometimes doing it without any sort of intention to observe boundaries, and yet still somehow participating in what it means to be a Jew. So what about the pepperoni? Every day of the year, we are commanded a set of practices regarding our food. There are certain animals that are in and certain animals that are out. There are ways of cooking and preparing our foods that are in and ways that are out. And what's kind of fascinating to me about this particular matzah pizza is that it really embodies one of the ways that people orient themselves to Judaism, which is that it's not something that we necessarily do every day. It's something that we do at certain moments and at certain times of the year. So at Pesach, I'm going to get chametz out of my home, but I'm not changing the other dietary practices that I might do all year round. And the fact of the matter is that with those kashrut practices that have to do with not mixing milk and meat and not eating forbidden meats, slipping around a little bit here. Those dietary practices that have to do with the foods that we eat all year round, they don't necessarily carry the same soul being cut off mi Yisrael quality. So I'm not saying from the bima anything. I want to leave the matzah pizza aside. I want you to now forget that I'm talking about salami from the bima, and think with me instead about mixing milk and meat and all of the dietary practices that evolve around how we eat our foods. So I didn't grow up in a kosher home, and I didn't grow up keeping kosher. And when I began to take on this practice, it was really in the context of living on a farm and seeing that we raised animals for milk, and inevitably part of raising animals for milk was about sometimes culling our flock and eating the animals for meat. And in that context, it felt very clear to me that the separation of milk and meat wasn't just a chok, wasn't just a kind of rule that we were supposed to follow just because God said so, but rather it was encouraging us to attend to the food that we eat, to understand the reasons behind why we eat it and where it comes from. And in that context, kashrut really was able to blossom in a different way than I think we often get to think about kashrut. Kashrut is both about the observance of boundaries in our food, and also potentially about intentionality and being very mindful and thoughtful about what we eat and how we eat it. And those two threads, you can kind of see sociologically how different Jewish communities have lifted up or lowered one or the other. So the idea of kashrut being a practice that's about boundaries is really part of getting more and more perfected in your absolute observance of kashrut. And the part that's about values and trying to be intentional about your food might lower some of those boundary concerns in order to eat a meal that is healthful and sort of nourishing. So I'm thinking right now about the large bag of very kosher LePesach potato chips that we bought leading into Pesach, which felt very good for my sort of ritual purposes of keeping Pesach and making sure there was absolutely no chametz. And on the other hand, felt like a little bit of a sacrifice of the kind of health that we want to have in our food other times of the year. And these ironies are throughout our kashrut practices. So the thing that I wanted to share in a sort of reflective mode, because I'm not up here to tell you there's a right or a wrong way to eat. Eating is something each person decides on their own terms at the end of the day. But I truly want to invite you to think about the aspect of kashrut that's not just about identity in the sense of how you are seen by others, but the kashrut that's actually between us and God. My very favorite scene from the movie Yentl happens in the beginning, when Yentl, who's a young Barbra Streisand, is learning Talmud with her father, and she says, like, I don't know if she calls him Abba, I can't remember. Abba, aren't you worried about the neighbors? Aren't you worried about God? And Yentl says, her father says, Yentl, I'm not worried about God and what God will think of you learning Torah. I'm worried about the neighbors. And then he lowers the curtain so that they can kind of secretly learn Talmud. And I think this aspect of how we practice and how we live our Yiddishkeit is actually a place where we can see flourishing and not anxiety. Because when we think about what we do in terms of our relationship with our own sense of growth, our own sense of boundaries for the sake of health, that is when a practice like kashrut becomes so special and so sacred. It's not about limitation. It's about the expansion that happens for us when we draw certain boundaries. And that's our relationship with the divine, much more than our trying to manage our anxieties about how we're viewed and how we're seen by others. So, For today, I'll leave it at that, but I have a feeling more thinking and talking about kashrut to come, because it is absolutely my favorite topic. And I figure as we begin the process of exiting Pesach, where we've had this very strict observance of no chametz, entering back into how we observe kashrut for the rest of the year, I hope this can give you some food for thought, no pun intended. And we'll turn back to our service at page 342, Chatzi Kaddish.